You are listening to Radio Aula Mundi.
Hi there, wherever you are. I'm Marco Rixecker, a freelance writer, reporter, producer, teacher, translator, tour guide, poet, singer, and songwriter. I speak several languages, and I'm the creator and founder of Radio Aula Mundi, an evolving podcast station where no language and all languages are spoken. It's a multilingual mix of music, poetry, lectures, languages, interviews, documentaries, recipes, and a lot more, co-produced with the students of the Aula Mundi International Cultural Center. You can find us on radioaulamundi.bandcamp.com, podcasts.apple.com, Spotify, YouTube, Breaker, Player FM, Facebook. Search Radio Aula Mundi. The following narrative includes excerpts from a collection of testimonies and interviews entitled Let's Talk About It Anywhere in the World, where it is all about people's voices, accents, and speech patterns, hand in hand with my own personal anecdotes and observations. In addition to that, people are free to introduce themselves and speak their minds openly, in their respective, often indigenous languages and dialects, without any paraphrases or expectations. So, let the story go on from there. Several times have I come across the name of Kurt Vonnegut. He was one of the most influential American writers in the second half of the 20th century. The first time I heard of him was when I walked the streets of Chicago in search of some interesting characters to do interviews with. One of the questions I would ask them was, "What is your favorite word or expression these days?" And one of the answers was, "Iconoclastic infundibulum." I'd be told that the phrase comes from a novel by Kurt Vonnegut. A couple of years later, I do some research on Kurt Vonnegut and his work. In the process, I discover a short story with a fascinating name, To Be Are Not To Be, written in numbers and letters. So, the title is an adaptation of one of William Shakespeare's most famous quotes from the play Hamlet, to be or not to be. It is a science fiction short story, which I get the opportunity to read not too long before my conversation with Christina Jarvis. The first time I see her name is when I read an article in Science magazine, which discusses Kurt Vonnegut's complicated relationship with science. And Christina Jarvis gets quoted quite a few times in the article. She's a Vonnegut scholar and teacher of English at New York State University at Fredonia. She gets back to me quickly after I reach out to her asking for an interview. And she's enthusiastic about the opportunity to get to speak about Kurt Vonnegut. Christina's hometown, Fredonia, is located right next to Lake Erie. Our email exchanges leading up to our online conversation have already revealed a certain sense of humor. As a matter of fact, scheduling an interview between different time zones is always complicated, and Christina got confused, something she ended up calling a Vonnegutian mistake. And keywords just like that are going to come up during our conversation. I also make sure to insert wordplays in the English language and use its different nuances, loops, and bounds. Christina Jarvis plays along, which is fortunate because at some point there's a technical glitch and parts of our conversation are deleted. So, we do it all over again, and I have to repeat some of my questions to her. Here too she goes along, and perfectly repeats her answers, which allows us to make it through our conversation all right, and leave no stone unturned in terms of exploring Kurt Vonnegut as a human being, author, and writer. And the same goes for Christina Jarvis herself. Obviously, our discussion also focuses on her, what she does, and how she got influenced by Kurt Vonnegut. For example, she tells me that the novelist inspired her to become a gardener and take better care of the environment in general. Her sense of humor is also based on his influence, and it shows when she answers some of my questions. So, as soon as Christina Jarvis and I connect online from different places in the world, I can see curiosity and open-mindedness in her eyes. And our conversation is going to confirm that she's curious about and open to all kinds of games and tasks. And so here we are. Christina Jarvis and I are able to connect and chat online from different places in the world.
Hello, my name is Christina Jarvis, and I am a professor of English at the State University of New York at Fredonia, which is in Western New York near Lake Erie. I teach primarily 20th century American literature, environmental literature, sustainability courses, and I'm some lucky mud because I get to teach courses on Kurt Vonnegut, who's one of my all-time favorite writers.
Which languages do you speak?
I only speak English fluently and well. I've studied a little bit of Spanish, Latin, and Italian, but I would be too embarrassed to try and speak any of it on this particular podcast where you have so many multilingual and fluent. But I guess I might be fluent in Vonnegutese or Vonnegutisms. And I could channel Tralfamadorians in the fourth dimension. So if we get into fourth dimension stuff, I might be fluent in some other things.
What kind of a language is English?
I would describe English as a language that has unusual privilege because it's, spoken all over the world. Obviously, it's part of many Romance languages and shares common roots. But I think that it's a language perhaps filled with landmines and road maps. I think that we have so many colloquialisms and idioms and bizarre things that don't translate. And living here in the United States, we have so many regional dialects and varieties. And so even though it is an official spoken language, there are many areas and subfields and things within it. But I do think that we are at a disadvantage because it is spoken so much over the world. I think in the United States, we fail our students by not exposing them to more languages. And one of my retirement goals is to learn more languages and become fluent.
Or maybe you could become a Kurt Vonnegut translator.
Well, there are already actually some wonderful translators, and I'm surprised to hear that he is not more widely read and translated now, because in his lifetime, he was a lot more widely translated, and he was very enthusiastic about bridging national, cultural, international divides. He was always trying to bring Rita Rate, his Russian translator, over to the United States at the height of the Cold War. He really was into this idea of planetary citizens and that art and languages and ideas exceed national and international boundaries. And he was always so generous about giving away rights to translate his languages. One of my favorite stories I found, he sold the rights to Mother Night for a Polish underground edition for like the equivalent of a nickel or a dime, a zloty. I might not be getting the coin right. So he really was committed to sharing his work with other countries, and I do hope that there are people out there that might take this up because you're probably already more fluent in languages than I am. It'll take me a while to catch up and do that, but who knows? Maybe in a bit of time.
Please define iconoclastic infundibulum.
Well, to be official in the Vonnegut cosmos, it would be a chronosynclastic infundibula. And it refers in the novel Sirens of Titan, there's a wave phenomenon where people can be spread out across multiple spaces and times simultaneously. And he also uses, so it describes kind of a science fiction term, but in other places, he uses it more metaphorically to think about cultural relativity of things being right or correct in different cultures, languages simultaneously. So it's a concept that is a sci-fi concept, but I think he also applies it culturally, again, bridging multiple times, boundaries, dimensions, that sort of thing.
Kurt, please tell me, what is writing?
There's, again, because of Kurt Vonnegut being at so many moments in time, I think he would say, one, it's a way to make your soul grow. It's a way to express yourself and be human and share things with other people. He would also say that it's a way of allowing a person of middling intelligence, given enough time and thought and bashing away to produce something that is a work of art that can be shared. But it is, I think, also for Vonnegut, a sacred art. I think if he were a patron saint of anything, it would be of writers. He was always willing to help out writers, encourage writers, because writing connects us. It bridges cultural divides, language divides. It's one of our fundamental human things that distinguishes us as a species. So Kurt would probably say it in a funny, humorous way with his wheezy laugh. So if you could kind of put that into the answer, but I think he would channel some of those ideas.
Why should I read Kurt Vonnegut?
I think Kurt Vonnegut makes us want to be better humans, but he also saw us for who we are and loved us anyway. I think Kurt Vonnegut captures the sort of worst traits of humanity, but also our most sacred and beautiful ones. And at this present time, when we are acting like a geological force on this planet, we need writers who can put us in our place, but also remind us of our humble origins. But I think the thing about Vonnegut, he combines science, anthropology, uh, scathing criticism, calling things out. He's an advocate for social justice, environmental justice, and he's also terribly funny. I think he has this line in Palm Sunday, there are two responses to many things in life, laughter and tears. And he says, I myself prefer laughter to tears. There's less cleaning up to do afterwards. So I think it's a kind of a unique blend of all of that that makes Vonnegut important right now. But I would also add that he was so forward thinking. I mean, this is a man who was experiencing climate, what we would call climate grief in 1971. He was talking about plastic pollution. I mean, his first novel, Player Piano from 1952, was looking at, the impacts of consumerism, as well as so many of the central questions we're still grappling with technology. So I think he's a writer that asks the big, still important questions. What kind of species are we? What are people for? That if we're mindful, caring human beings, these are not easily settled kinds of answers, and that we should still be striving for. But I think given the often crazy, unpredictable world that we live in, we also need someone who can remind us of joy and make us laugh, while also calling out and putting us human beings in our place at times. So for all of those reasons, I'd say pick up a Vonnegut novel. I'm a huge fan of Galapagos. It might not be the easiest if you're new to English, but I can guarantee you that it's a gem.
To be or not to be? What kind of question is that?
Well, I think obviously channeling Hamlet, that's so Vonnegut to kind of have that Shakespeare humor. I thought you were actually going to refer to the report on the Barnhouse effect, his very first published story, which is also so relevant because it's a fantasy about stopping war. I mean, here we are with the war in Ukraine. I mean, Vonnegut was always reimagining throughout his life this fantasy that human beings might stop blowing each other up and start creating things. But to be or not to be, written out fits in his population segment of stories, where again he's looking at um, impacts and what it means to be a human life. In that case, though, the future is perfect. I mean, it's this weird. Everything is all the problems have been solved. Humans live forever. It has to be a choice to die or to make room for someone else. You have to kill it. So he raises those kinds of big ethical questions. But again, as you point out with the title, it's this allusion to a very serious work and get within English and Hamlet. And he does that with Cat's Cradle. It begins with a reference to Moby Dick. He makes these serious allusions, but then he undercuts it and plays with it. But then he also returns to a lot of those same core existential questions or big ideas that great literature does attend to, while also being kind of funny in there.
It has a moral, and the moral, in my opinion, is okay, it's a perfect word, but nobody's happy in it.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
you see that a lot, especially in some of the short stories. So many of them are concerned, raising questions about technology or these quick kinds of fixes. And I think that especially now, I mean, we just have Chat GPT, and we're at this moment with AI and all of these advances in technology. Vonnegut was asking from the beginning, in Player Piano, before we go any further, please ask the supercomputer, what are people for? He was always building in these ethical, important questions about humanity into his fiction. And so many of them are still relevant. So many of them are still so applicable now. And I think his short stories are great places to begin. Harrison Bergeron's one that is very popular in the United States, raising big questions about ethics and equality. Epicac, which is basically a rewriting of the Cyrano de Bergerac story, but with a computer falling in love with a human being, and in the end, of course, for people who don't know the story, the computer acts more human and kindly than the human being in the story. So a lot of his short stories are great teaching tools, especially as you have a lot of international students and with English as a second language. Those would be some perhaps better places to begin than diving into some of the novels.
Two bees or not two bees? What kind of question is it now?
Well, now if we're talking about, our pollinators and the collapse of our insects, which I'm told are, in a terrible state because of human encroachment. But he actually had a story about bees called the Drone King. you know and Vonnegut in my book Lucky Mud and Other Foma, I look at his early naturalist experiences and his good friend who Ben Hitz, to whom he dedicates Jailbird. And he actually was his tent mate, and he was an entomologist, studying and classifying insects. So Vonnegut, he actually probably knew a lot about bees. It made it's not in his. It was published in the complete short stories called The Drone King. It wasn't published in his lifetime, but he has a story about ants too, the petrified ants. So
What's your idea of what life looks like?
as a human being on this planet, life is a an adventure filled with buzzing with life and many species and interactions and cultural moments and weather and time and love, romance, people. But I think it's also important for me to step outside of my kind of human privilege and especially my American privilege and see life from other perspectives and remind us of our shared origins because human beings, like so much else and matter on this, we're just stardust. We're 60% water and stardust, and we are connected to animals and plants and land and mud and all of this. So I think although I get to have this kind of privileged Homo sapien upright mammal with opposable thumbs and that vision, but we're also chemical sensory idiots. There's so much that we don't even see that's going on, ultraviolet rays and radiations. And so although I could only kind of see through my human eyes this adventure and these moments on the planet, I think it's important to remind us of all of our fellow earthling travelers and beings and entities and molecules here along with us.
Why did you choose the title Lucky Mud for your book?
Well, for listeners who are not familiar with Kurt Vonnegut's 1963 novel Cat's Cradle, Lucky Mud is a reference to a creation story in this invented religion called Bokononism. And human beings are the lucky mud that got to sit up and look around and are lucky because they get to be active and agents. And so I like that idea because I think when we think about Kurt Vonnegut's environmentalism, human beings are so central to it. He looks at how we act on the planet with a geological force and, look at the conditions of the Anthropocene. But he also reminds us that we're just one species among many. We're really just mud that does get to sit up and look around, and that we are connected to everything. And I think it's that combination between, the sort of kind of force and dominance that we have as a species, but also this humble, interconnected being. And I think that captures Vonnegut. Vonnegut is a writer with so many paradoxes in multiple dimensions. So I like that. And I also wanted something that kind of used his language and captured kind of the spirit of Kurt. And the other part, the FOMA, the harmless untruths, is also a reference to Bokononism. So I wanted to just sort of channel that fun spirit of Vonnegut with the title.
What's your favorite breakfast of champions like?
Well, I could tell your listeners I don't drink martinis for breakfast. My breakfast of champions would probably be waffles or pancakes with my own homemade syrup. I'm a huge jam maker, canner. So I make blueberry syrup, strawberry syrup, raspberry syrup. It would include Rosie Joy's farm fresh eggs that I get delivered to my door, as well as her local pork. I'm an omnivore, so I do eat local meats, and so her bacon. So it would be Rosie Joy's eggs, herbs from my garden, seasoning the scrambled eggs, the bacon, pancakes with my homemade syrup, and then good coffee. Good coffee. We're really fortunate. We have a friend who gets organic fair trade beans and he roasts them. And so it would be something that I think channels good, wholesome ingredients, and it's all pretty tasty as well.
Who would he like to chat with and have dinner with?
Oh, that's a tough question. For your listeners, his brother Bernard, of course, was a very famous atmospheric physicist, and so he actually got to meet and chat with, and he knew Stephen Jay Gould and even got a letter for Galapagos, and the science was sound. I think it might be Newton or Einstein, because in Timequake, and for people who are not familiar, that novel, the universe suffers a crisis of self-confidence. It doesn't know whether to keep on expanding or not. So there's this timequake and everything goes back. But he plays with notions of time so much that I think that he would be interested and probably give the nod more to Einstein because of his theories of relativity and his references to Einstein. And I think if he could sit down and question and have that, I know that he would not want to sit down with scientists that invented atomic weapons and bombs. So if I were to wager, I guess I'd pick Einstein.
So, to you, what's the difference between Vonnegutian and Vonnegutesque?
Oh, I guess Vonnegutian would describe a larger range of phenomenon, things that could exist in the Vonnegut cosmos. So whether it's, fluid notions of time, where Tralfamadorians see time as landscape, or if someone is acting kind, like, God bless you, Mr. Rosewater, or being a secular saint, someone who behaves decently in an indecent society. So I think Vonnegutian describes the broader cosmos and range of ideas, where Vonnegut-esque I would see as a narrower reference to things that adhere more to his style, or kind of more particularly matched to key Vonnegut ideas or texts. So I guess I see one as much more broad and one as more narrow and specific.
Vonnegutesque actually rhymes with burlesque. Now, how Vonnegutian is that?
It's very Vonnegutian, actually. And for people who know his alter ego Kilgore Trout and his stories and his publications, there are so many extra layers there that I will let the super fans among your listeners sort out and appreciate. But that really there's an extra layer there.
Are you afraid of the future?
Well, I think in terms of thinking about population, I mean, we're already at 8 billion. We're going to reach 10 or 11 billion. And I think of Gandhi, there's enough for the world of need, but there's not enough for the world of greed. If we use our resources equitably, fairly, responsibly, we can support that many human beings and start to actually take up and use less mass and space and habitat on the planet. I live by the FOMA that make me brave and happy and kind. And I think I have to be optimistic because I have 2 sons that I love more than life itself. And so pessimism isn't necessarily an option that I can embrace. So, but I'm a realist too. I do recognize, I understand the science. And if you look at the numbers and everything that's happening and aren't alarmed, but I think what Vonnegut gives me is that outside perspective to ask the questions people aren't asking now. I mean, Vonnegut talked about us having a secretary of the future, and Sweden has one, and more countries. We should all have secretaries of the future. We should all be thinking generations out. But what just because I channel Vonnegut, we're coming to think about the Anthropocene as a geological epoch. It's not official yet. And we're really caught at this transition between the Holocene and the Anthropocene. But Vonnegut makes me think, well, what would the end of the Anthropocene look like? Does that mean that we are no longer dominating, the planet? Have we been wiped out? And I think we need to imagine better futures and ideas if we're going to have them. So we need literature. We need these connections. We need to love humanity individually, collectively, in the abstract, if we are going to get this right. So I am actually somewhat heartened by recent decisions. And I also think that we don't give enough press to all the good work that people are doing collectively around the world.
Christina Jarvis's open-mindedness motivates me to branch out at the end of our conversation, which is when I frequently give people something to read to illustrate our talk with. So one might guess that I would want Christina Jarvis to read from one of Kurt Vonnegut's texts. But instead I ask her to read a poem written by Patti Smith. She finds the poem lovely, and it motivates me to ask her 2 follow-up questions, one for her Kurt Vonnegut alter ego, and one for herself, which causes Christina to call our conversation a Vonnegutian exchange that we both would love to continue at some point, anytime, anywhere in the world. And the story goes on from there.
The Sheep Lady from Algiers by Patti Smith. Nodding though the lamps lit low, nodding for passers underground, to and fro she's darning, and the yarn is weeping red and pale, marking the train stops from Algiers. Sleeping though the eyes are pale, hums in rhythm with a bonnet on a lullaby, a broken song, the sifting cloth is bleeding red and weeping yarn from Algiers. Lullaby, though baby's gone, the cradle rocks a barren song. She's rocking with ribbons on, she's rocking yarn and needles. Oh, it's long coming from Algiers.
How do you react to this poem?
I think it is a beautiful expression of planetary citizenship and ideas exceeding boundaries and reminding us that art and beauty can be found anywhere on this planet and human beings. And I think we all need to share in these arts and humanity, especially if they could remind us to work towards peace. And this is all radio, so people can't see behind me, but I'm literally sitting in front of a counted cross-stitch family tree that my mom made, and generations of women who sewed and knitted and had these beautiful crafts and this sort of, and so there was just this extra element, with the yarn and the knitting and these very human and very woman, feminine rocking. It could have been any family connection, but I think with those extra elements spoke to me on a deeply personal level because of those connections to the knitters and the yarn and the ribbon owners and makers in my life as well. So it's had this extra level of resonance for me.